Welcome everyone to this event in the Institute for Religion, Culture, and Public Life series on climate change. My name is Matthew Engelke. I'm the director of IRCPL. It's a real pleasure to welcome Elizabeth Kolbert and Mark Taylor, with whom she will be in conversation. Elizabeth will be speaking to the title of In Deep Water COVID Climate Change. So three small topics there, but we're really looking forward to this. Let me just say a few words of introduction for both of our speakers, although I think neither of them need much in the way of introduction because they're so well known and esteemed in their respective fields. Elizabeth Kolbert, I'm sure everyone here knows her writing, not only from the New Yorker. Today I just got my New York Review of Books, and I see she has an article there this week, I believe. But she is the author of a number of books as well, to include the Pulitzer Prize winning The Sixth Extinction and Unnatural History, and I believe most recently Under a White Sky, The Nature of the Future. Mark Taylor is joining us as well to be in conversation with Elizabeth. Mark is a colleague here at Columbia University, where he teaches in the Department of Religion. He was one of the co-founding directors of IRCPL a little over a decade ago. He is a philosopher of religion and a public intellectual. He's written way too many books to catalog, but on topics as maybe orthodox and traditional for philosophy of religion as Hegel and Kierkegaard and Derrida, but he's also written incredibly widely on issues to do with space, time, death, and modernity. So it's really great to have them together. Because if I can say, they know each other, and that always makes for an interesting conversation. And B, because I think, this being IRCPL, we'll have to see what Mark has to say, but some of the themes of the Institute touching on the relationships between culture and public life and religion, which has not been a main focus of Elizabeth's work, but Mark might ask her some questions about. So we're very excited to have both of them with us. So just before I turn over, Elizabeth is going to speak only for a few minutes. It really is going to be a conversation between the two of them. There will be a point maybe about 6:15 or so, depending before our or maybe 6:30 before our end time at 6:45 for questions from the audience. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You should be able to see the Q&A function. Just open that up and put your questions in there, and Professor Taylor will get to as many as he can. So once again, a very warm welcome to our speakers and to all of our guests. And so I'm going to turn over to Mark now. Thanks so much, Mark.
Thank you, Matthew. And thank you for all the impressive programs you and the Institute do on a regular basis. It's a real contribution to the university and to the wider community. As Matthew suggested, tonight we're very fortunate to have a very special guest, Elizabeth Kolbert. Betsy and I, as Matthew noted, have known each other for quite a few years. And we're coming to you this evening from Williamstown, Massachusetts, where we spend many of our days sitting at desks across the valley from each other, reading and writing. Elizabeth Kolbert is one of our most important and influential science writers. Betsy's range is extraordinary, and the depth and rigor of her analyses are remarkable. We're increasingly bombarded with news of impending natural disasters, and she has the rare ability to explain the complexities of issues we thought we understood. Perhaps more important, She identifies critical problems before others recognize them. Who knew that a cave filled with dying bats somewhere in Vermont would be so important a few years later when someone on the other side of the world ate a bat? For many years, she has been sounding an alarm with an intelligent urgency that we ignore at our own peril. Betsy, it's a genuine privilege to have you here tonight. And you begin with a few words of your own.
Okay, all right, thank you. I will start very quickly by thanking Columbia, by thanking the IRCPL, and by thanking Mark. And I'm very flattered because Mark is such an impressive figure. So it's very high praise indeed, Mark, thank you. And Mark and I we've had a sort of an ongoing conversation over the years, which usually takes place on the street, actually, on the roads of Williamstown when we happen to meet. So I look forward to a more formal conversation. And I don't have sort of a formal agenda. Mark probably does, but I thought I would just say a few words that will sort of explain, where I'm coming from. How's that situate things a bit. And so over the last 20 years, I've been writing about environmental issues, or what is sometimes really blandly called global change. And in particular, I've been interested in the ways in which humans are changing the planet on a really truly on a geological scale, so on a more or less permanent scale. I've written about droughts and floods and climate change and ocean acidification and extinction, and then more about climate change. And obviously, I'm not a scientist myself. I have very little science background myself, but what has really drawn me to this topic as a humanist, as a person who studied humanities, is the extraordinary moment in which we live, and that I really can't exaggerate it and stress enough. I mean, this is an unprecedented moment in many different ways in Earth's history, and that is all due to our actions, and that has sort of reversed a lot of years of thinking in which we decentralized humans. We, learned that the sun doesn't revolve around the earth revolves around the sun. Humans are just another animal. We've had this sort of decentering of the human, and now we kind of have to acknowledge that we're actually a very, very interesting creature who is capable of altering the entire planet, and not for the better, let's put it that way. So some of the ways, and I will not even list them all, that we are changing the planet on a geological scale is obviously through climate change, warming the whole planet, warming the oceans. We see more and more evidence of the depths to which we're warming the oceans. We're changing the very chemistry of the oceans. We're remixing the biosphere. We're bringing together all these lineages that were evolved separately for many, in many cases, tens of millions of years, getting some very nasty surprises. Remixing the biosphere brought us COVID. We are changing sediment patterns by damming up the rivers. Wherever you look, and people have looked at this very carefully, what are the markers of this geological moment that has informally become known as the Anthropocene? You see that there are ways in which our impacts will still be visible if we project out for tens and even hundreds of millions of years. So recently, I have become interested in our response to this. What is our response to this going to be? The science becomes clearer and clearer. The on-the-ground impacts become clearer and clearer. And yet we seem stuck. We seem stuck socially, politically, and ethically. And maybe that's something that Mark and I will also discuss tonight. And so we have started to reach, I think, you can already see, for some sort of technological fix that's going to get us out of this. And that is really the subject of my latest book, Under White Sky. And just to name a few of the fixes that I look at in that book, and maybe we'll discuss some of them, are creating fake floods. Our topic tonight, one of our themes is water, trying to re-flood, let the Mississippi flood in a sort of very controlled way because of the effects of controlling flooding have been so disastrous and led to so much land loss. In Southern Louisiana, gene editing, an incredibly powerful tool that potentially could reverse or help stave off some extinctions. You could breed in resilience potentially to some species that are being very hard hit by climate change. Say these are pretty out there, but they're not impossible. And one of the technologies that I look at is also for covering the entire planet in a kind of haze of reflective particles to try to counteract climate change. So these are all very live discussions. Some of them are actually technologies that are in the works. We're actually using them already, and some of them are slightly more futuristic. And then while I was writing that book, COVID hit. So just as I was reporting the last chapters, and COVID, I think, which we're also going to talk about tonight, really falls into this pattern of we find ourselves in a jam, and because in this case, precisely because we're such a globalized species that we took this disease around the world instantaneously. And then we could not do the forms of control. We had these massive tomes about how you should deal with the pandemic. They were just sort of ignored. And so those controls did not work. We had to wait for a technofix. And we were very, very fortunate to get vaccines, these really amazing cutting edge vaccines, mRNA vaccines, the first of their kind. But we also find that, technofixes are not necessarily fixes. They don't bring you back to where you were. They bring you into a new realm. And that's the realm that we live in now. So I'm gonna leave it there. I'm gonna turn it back to Mark, but that is the sort of perspective, I guess, from which I am viewing a lot of what's happening in the world right now.
Okay, terrific, Betsy. And you've identified several of the threads that I want to tug on this evening. But I want to begin somewhat differently. As you suggested, we share many concerns. We come at them from somewhat different angles. And I regularly use your books, particularly changing in my course, Changing Places. But I want to begin by talking about time and space a bit. We're going to talk about time quite a bit later, but I want to begin by talking about space, or more precisely, place. I always tell my students that what you think and what you write are to a large extent a function of when you think and where you think. And we both live here in the Berkshires, and I was wondering if you could reflect a bit on how this place and where you live and think shapes what you think.
Well, that's a really interesting question, and I feel very fortunate in a way, because I think that I know we're speaking to a lot of people in New York. I think New York has so much coming at you. Williamstown does not have that much coming at you. And so I have felt that, honestly, the lack of distractions, though, the web has, and when I first came to Williamstown, you basically, could barely get internet. I mean, so it was really, you could barely get phone service, so it was really lack of distractions. The internet has, kind of changed that, sadly, I guess, or happily, depending on your perspective. But, and COVID really shut us down. I mean, we did not, leave Williamstown for months and months. So there's a, good and bad component to really being in this little bubble here. But I think that it has also shaped my thinking in the way that it is, a very manipulated landscape. It's not it's not Manhattan, it's not LA, but it still bears a lot of marks, which I have come to see more and more as I delve into this, and that we live in a landscape that was completely deforested. It's all, to the extent that it looks quite heavily forested now. It's all second growth forest. A lot of the we have eagles are now back, for example. That's brand new. We've seen waves of wildlife that have come and gone, and in some cases come back. So it's interesting to watch that. So I do think that I sometimes wish, honestly, for what I am writing about, that I were in a kind of wilder space. But there is a lot you can see. I always tell people, if you go in your backyard, you can find a lot of signs of what is happening on a planetary level. And that's definitely true in Williamstown. Our seasons are changing. It's all pretty out there.
Good. So picking up on the whole professional side, as I've read your writings over the years, I've often thought, Betsy really has one of the coolest jobs I can imagine, right? But then I also find myself sometimes thinking, wow, Betsy really has guts. I'm not sure I'd be willing to go where she's going and do what she's doing. I mean, you take your readers on these journeys with you. And the narratives are totally engaging, from caves of bats to Greenland to rainforest to the deepest oceans. And you have an uncanny ability to identify what really matters. What's the diciest trip you ever took?
Well, the diciest, I want to preface this by saying I am not a very brave person, as my family will tell you, but I guess there's two of me, because when I do go out there, I do go with the flow. How's that? When someone takes me out on a trip, you signed up and you're in for a penny, in for a pound, as they say. And I guess there are two dicey trips I took, and one has a very tragic. I've been up on the Greenland ice sheet a couple of times, and once I went to a place that was pretty near the sort of the melt line, the line between accretion of ice and melting off. Anyway, it was pretty warm already when I went there, and there were crevasses. People kept saying there are crevasses here, be careful, but there's no way to be careful, because if the crevasse is under the snow, you're gonna fall through. And really tragically, the guy who ran this camp, who was became a friend, I really, really liked him. He was a great guy. Just, I guess, 2 summers ago at the camp where we all were, where he was assuring me that everything would be fine, he fell into a crevasse and died. So did it feel dicey at the time? It was a little nerve-wracking, but I guess it was dicier than I thought. And also there had been another decade of warming, so it became all the more dicey over time, unfortunately. And the other dicey trip I took, which I kind of described in the Sixth Extinction, was out over the Great Barrier Reef at night with someone who didn't know how to read or navigating equipment that we were using. So there we were, really up to our necks in water, not being able to figure out how to get back, and the tide was coming in. And that was surreal, truly surreal. I don't know what prevented me from just freaking out, but here I am today. So
right, there you are.
Yeah.
So sort of related in terms of the personal narratives. I mean, you introduced us to such a cast of remarkable characters. Who are 1 or 2 of the really most memorable characters that you've met on these journeys? I mean, they're remarkable scientists, but they're characters.
Yeah, well, that's a really good question too. And once again feel really lucky because I have met, a lot of really great, smart, dynamic, crazy people in my reporting career. And one of the most dynamic people was this guy, Connie Steffen, who I just described, who died on Greenland. And he was just people who go to the Arctic, they are the sort of modern day Arctic explorers, and they just love the ice and thrill. I think the danger is part of it. And he had, he was one of these people who had spent a winter on some tiny little Arctic island by himself. And he loved that, being at the edge. And he had also rappelled down a moulin, which is a sort of hole in the ice sheet where meltwater is just pouring down. It goes through this deep hole that it carves in the ice till it gets to the bottom of the ice sheet. And when it starts to freeze up again in the fall, you could rappel down, which is something that you couldn't get me to do for many millions of dollars. But he loved that. That was his. He just considered that great fun, and it's fantastic, it's beautiful. It has this blue light in it, so it must have been an amazing experience. So he was a wonderful character and a really, really great guy. So that's just one person. Another person I met in the course of my reporting of Under White Sky, I know this has a very tragic, all these stories have a tragic end. Was a woman named Ruth Gates, if anyone's watched the movie Chasing Coral, she's in that. She was a very dynamic marine scientist who came up with this project to try to breed tougher corals that could withstand climate change. And, she and we definitely didn't sort of see eye to eye on everything, but she was a very, very dynamic person. Took me out in Hawaii to see reefs that were dead and reefs that were surviving for some reason, more resilient reefs. And she very much influenced my thinking, and very tragically died a couple of years after I met her, when I was about to go out to visit her again.
Okay, thanks. I want to turn now to the article that Matthew mentioned a minute ago. Yeah. The Greeks still have lessons to teach us in curious ways. And the earliest philosophers interpreted the cosmos in terms of the four elements: earth, water, fire, and air. And I was going to begin the conversation this evening with water, and we'll come to that in a minute. But then a friend called my attention to your article in the February 24th New York Review of Books. Paper copy gets here late in the Berkshires. So I read it this morning. I was really quite taken by it. What we understand now, that I don't think the Greeks fully understood, is that these four elements are inextricably interrelated and codependent. So in your review, in this essay, you're reviewing two books that deal with waste, human waste and animal waste in certain ways, and the relationship of this waste to dirt and soil, which are not necessarily the same thing. And you start with dirt, but you eventually move into water and air in certain ways. Then with characteristic wit, you indicate toward the end of the essay, will humanity ever get its shit together? Not in the foreseeable future, you say. But in all your diverse writings, you're weaving together a consistent, coherent story about how these systems and structures are interrelated and interconnected. And I want to return to that later. But for now, let's begin with waste and earth and dirt, all the while remembering that the word human comes from the word humus. What's so important about shit and dirt? And how does the problem of dirt flow into the problems of water, air, and fire?
Well, that that essay, I want to credit the the New York Review of Books. They just handed me these 2 books, which the editors of the magazine and obviously thought were in some kind of fruitful dialogue. One is a book that is it's literally about sewage, what we do with human waste, just sort of a history of sewage, and also some innovations in the sewage world. How's that? And it's kind of a popular book written for a popular audience. It's called The Other Dark Matter, and the other is called A World Without Soil, which is a much more technical book written to really raise the alarm about soil loss, that we are losing our soils at a much higher rate than they can be replenished. And I guess if there's a theme to everything that we're doing now, it is that we are, loss is taking place at a much higher rate than things can be replenished. How's that? And they are linked, obviously linked on some level, because we, are everything that we are, all of us, and everything that we eat is obviously, sucking nutrients out of the soil. And, in a natural system, they would all be returned to the soil in some form of waste, or, we would all ultimately end up as compost. But what we've very cleverly managed to do is take those nutrients out, and now we flush them into waterways, which has a disastrous consequence, creating anoxic zones in the oceans, for example, as a result of both our fertilizer use and our release of sewage into waterways. So this cycle, which used to be sort of self-regulating, I guess you would say, has now, we've separated the 2 parts of it, taking the nutrients in and putting them, so we're constantly moving them to where they shouldn't be, taking them where they should be, and moving them to where they shouldn't be. And soil, is very much related to that. We are, plowing through it, letting it wash away, basically, at a, as I said, at a much higher rate than it can possibly be replenished. There's 8 billion of us on the planet at this point, almost, and we all need to eat. And so we are really threatening, our own survival here. And that came through pretty clearly in this book, which is a pretty dry book, but the message is pretty stark.
I want to have you say more about fertilizer and nitrogen in particular, but also about the impact of what we call techno farming in certain ways. I think in Jared Diamond's book Collapse, at one point he suggests that for every one, I don't know if it's accurate, but for every 1 bushel of corn we produce, we lose seven bushels of topsoil, which so part of this is part of the water problem is also the pollution of aquifers. The nitrogen has an enormous impact on plant life and river and eventually ocean ecology and the like. And in addition to that, the pulverization of the resulting plowing leads to air contamination that we have. So, this kind of which affects the atmosphere, which creates conditions for more forest fires, which creates mudslides and water and everything. But nitrogen is so important.
Yes, I think it is an underappreciated, we are very focused on, we're not as focused as we should be, how's that? But there's a lot of discussion about how we have, completely altered the carbon cycle. We're just taking huge amounts of carbon out of the ground and releasing them to the air, which has the effect of also, pumping them into the ocean. So we're taking carbon from one reservoir and putting it in a different place. And that is, climate change and ocean acidification. But the nitrogen cycle, we have really also altered perhaps as fundamentally as the carbon cycle. The only way you used to be able to fix nitrogen was an occasional lightning strike or legumes, plants that host these nitrogen fixing bacteria in their roots. Now we just pour huge, we create synthetic fertilizer. We have huge amounts of nitrogen. It's estimated that humans produce in our fertilizer plants, we are producing as much nitrogen as all terrestrial ecosystems combined. And that a lot of that nitrogen, just washes away. We overuse fertilizer too terribly, and it just washes away. And these are the huge dead zones. For example, the dead zone that opens up in the Gulf of Mexico every summer, that is a result of that. But another way that I think nitrogen, is changing the world and is little talked about and honestly little studied, but I think is probably going to get more study, is it really changes the vegetation. A lot of plants used to be nitrogen. Nitrogen was a huge limitation. If you were not a nitrogen fixer, you had to get nitrogen from somewhere, and the vegetation was determined by which plants could access nitrogen. And now that we have just littered the world with nitrogen, a lot of it which leaches off our fields and into our ecosystems, we are changing the whole patterns of vegetation. And some people are concerned that that is potentially one of the reasons we are losing insects. We seem to be having an insect crisis. And does that have something to do with it, that we've changed the vegetation in ways that we haven't even thought about or noticed, but in ways that is affecting the insects that needed those plants that we've somehow displaced by just drenching everything in nitrogen. So that's not talked about a lot, but potentially a pretty serious problem.
So we were all these issues overlap. So I want to turn more directly now to water. And I've argued for many years that I think water will be the critical issue of the 21st century. And the issue is obvious, but it still doesn't get that much attention in its multiple aspects. I mean, as you mentioned, we have floods, we have violent storms, we have droughts. We'll talk about that in a minute. We have the saturated atmosphere, we have melting glaciers, we have contaminated aquifers with all of this. But let's talk about oceans a little bit. We hear so much about, the increase in temperatures in the oceans, there's an article in the Times last week about the extraordinary increase in the temperatures of the oceans. In your field notes of catastrophe, one of the aspects of that book that I found very, very interesting, because I had not known about it, was this whole idea of the conveyor belt. And so what I'd like you to try to explain to us is the interrelationship between melting glaciers, increase in temperatures of ocean waters, this conveyor belt phenomenon, and weather patterns. And maybe you could connect that back to Columbia a little bit, because it was a Columbia professor and I would like to hear some stories about that, but who died just recently. I actually did an interview with him one time for IRCPL, Wally Bruckner. And tell us a little bit about some of the contributions Columbia has made to this. Those of us at Columbia always understand the corner of Broadway and 112th Street in terms of Joe's Restaurant and Seinfeld, but more important stuff is going on there than all that. So I know that's a lot, but
that is a lot.
The conveyor belt's the central notion.
Okay, we'll start with the conveyor belt, which, as you say, Wally Broker was very instrumental in sort of determining the importance of that. And what that refers to is also sometimes referred to as the thermohaline circulation. It's this vast circulation pattern, really global. And one of the key drivers of it is this cold, salty water off of Greenland that's very dense and sinks. And as it sinks, it draws this warmer water up north to this area, and then you get this under, this sinking motion, and that is driving this conveyor belt, which really keeps water moving around the world and has a sort of 1,000-year cycle, basically. And what we're doing, and the reason that this is very much, sort of a current topic of investigation and a current topic of worry, is if you're melting a lot of fresh water off of Greenland, which we are, we know that from very sophisticated measurements, then you're getting a lot of fresh water, which is less dense, and you are potentially interfering with that sinking, and therefore you wouldn't be drawing that warmer water in. You would, the fear is ultimately you would shut down the Gulf Stream, basically. That's what's driving the Gulf Stream. And then you would have this weird paradox where, the planet would be getting warmer, but Europe, which is really at a latitude, much of Europe is at a latitude where it, would naturally be much colder without the Gulf Stream. For example, the UK would get colder, so that's sort of the, day after tomorrow scenario or whatever, I guess. And that's a very active subject of research, even as we speak, whether that overturning is slowing down. So to get to the contribution of Columbia, which is vast, and it extends both to GISS, which is located, as you said, above Tom's restaurant. That's the Goddard Institute for Space Studies outpost, and NASA outpost, where a lot of really groundbreaking world work in climate modeling was done, is still being done. And there's also Lamont Doherty, which is part of Columbia, across the river, which has, an amazing collection, for example, an amazing collection of ocean cores, where a lot of key work is going on climate change, trying to reconstruct the climates of the past, trying to reconstruct the history of the world, which also gives us hints into the future of the world, for better or worse. So a lot of key work in a lot of key subjects of, global change going on over there across the river, but part of Columbia.
All right, now I want to turn to drought, which is another water problem. I mean, it's a global problem. We read the reports that by 2030 there'll be no glaciers in Glacier National Park. By 2070, the glaciers in Tibet will be gone, which will be catastrophic because those glaciers feed all the major four rivers for Asia and the like. But I have for many years, as you may know, sort of taken Las Vegas as something like a weather vane. And I'd like to ask you to tell us a little bit more about your trip to Nevada and Vegas, that you recount that extraordinarily memorable essay, The Lost Canyon under Lake Powell, for this. But and again, this is related to glaciers as well. I mean, the impact of this global drought that's going on, and the impact of it in the West, and just tell us something about it, and tell us about this wonder world that has appeared because Lake Powell is disappearing.
Yeah, that was a great trip that I took about this summer, last June, I guess. So readers of anyone who's read Edward Abbey's Desert Solitaire will know that, Glen Canyon was this canyon. It's a canyon of the Colorado. It's a canyon, really, I guess, two canyons up, I guess, from Grand Canyon, and it was dammed in the 60s to create Lake Powell, named after John Wesley Powell, the one-armed Civil War general who made the first, sort of chronicled descent through the Grand Canyon, and that loss of that canyon, many people considered it more beautiful than Grand Canyon. it was sort of always considered a crime, really. And and now there's, as you were suggesting, there's a terrible drought in the southwestern U.S. The southwestern U.S. has probably always been drought prone. We have tree ring records going back for quite a while, and we can see in those, and when I say we, I really mean scientists, and I'm sure there are scientists at Lamont working on this, for very, very, very serious droughts, one of which probably led to the demise of a whole, indigenous culture in the Four Corners area. It's called Ancestral Puebloans, and they just really had to leave the area. The whole culture kind of died out, many hundreds of years ago because of one of these extreme droughts. And right now, we are in another one. Now, there also are now, many, many millions of people living in the Southwest, depending on the Colorado River. So how this is going to play out. So the drought has re-exposed a lot of Glen Canyon. The water level is so low that Lake Powell, which is this huge reservoir, this is the one, the second biggest in the country after Lake Mead, the water level has just plummeted. It's down over 150 feet. You see when you go there, it's quite beautiful. It's this huge bathtub ring, this white calcareous kind of coating on the canyons that looks, really weird. And I don't know if it will ever disappear. But you can now go up into some of the side canyons of that because they're dry, and they haven't been dry for 60 years. So they're quite phenomenal. There's quite a lot of mixed feelings because some people love Lake Powell, some people hated Lake Powell, some people called it the Blue Death. But the really profound question that I was trying to get at in that piece, besides just this reopening of this sort of magical canyon, is what do you do when you have a water policy? You have a river that's simply been over allocated. There's just no doubt that the Colorado is over allocated, and people are very, very, very reluctant, to change. But change is coming at us, and this will test our political system, mightily, because something is going to have to give out there.
Could you say something about the relationship of this to food?
Well, there's definitely water going into a lot of water going into agriculture.
70%.
I'm sorry.
70% of Colorado water goes into agriculture.
Yeah, and the question of whether a lot of that, honestly, is not. We don't quote unquote need it. I mean, it's going to alfalfa for cattle. And things that we could change our food habits and do without it. And we're probably going to have to do that, to be honest. But I don't think, I don't know what impact it will have on agriculture, but it's definitely going to squeeze out a lot of farmers and ranchers. Whether it's going to have, impacts on the supermarket in the near to medium term future, I'm not sure, because there's so much sort of subsidized water and subsidized farming that probably shouldn't be happening anyway. So that's a question a bit beyond my expertise, I'm afraid.
Okay, so I want to come at the issue of COVID, though, from a different angle, and that's permafrost, in a certain way. Our mutual friend Jim Shepard has I think a very important, much overlooked novel called Phase 6, which is basically about a mining company in Greenland that, while digging for the precious metals that make it possible for us to have iPhones and computers so we can meet today, release a toxin that leads to a global pandemic in all this. And more recently, just last week, your colleague at the New Yorker, Yosa Yaffa, had a very disturbing article about the melting of permafrost in Siberia. and where in 2016 the heat waves hit 100 degrees, he reports. But what was the most disturbing thing for me in that was his reporting of a reindeer herder who had a herd of 200 reindeer that suddenly died. And on investigation, they discovered that the death had been a result of the release of what's the chemical?
Anthrax.
Yeah, right, of anthrax, which they thought had been obliterated in that way. But the way in which, whether it's the rainforest or whether it's permafrost is melting, is releasing these toxins that cause these pandemics. That COVID is not going to be the last pandemic. We know that. So part of what I'd be, what have we learned and what have we not learned over the past 2 years?
Yeah. Well, I also want to put in a plug for Jim's book. It's a great book, Phase 6, and that issue of what are we releasing from the permafrost, which we don't want to encounter, is a really interesting and important one. I think that probably closer to home and in the COVID era is simply the way that we treat animals, and how our encroachment into habitat and our constantly bringing in creatures from the forest, which is not something that is so prevalent here in the US, but in a lot of parts of the world where people are hunting game out in the forest. That's where you're going to get animals that you're going to be bringing in with unknown pathogens, and where you're going to get potentially spillover events. And so spillover events, another book that I will recommend is by David Quammen, Spillover, completely prescient about COVID, though he didn't know it was going to be COVID, but the book actually lays out exactly how the next pandemic is going to happen. It's going to happen because some animal is brought in maybe to a wet market and shits on something else, and so some virus passes from one species to another and jumps then to humans. And that's probably the most likely way in which COVID reached us, though we don't know how COVID reached us. We don't know what this sort of intermediary species was, or if there was one, we may never know. And what links both of these, I think, really powerfully and is globalization. I mean, in Jim's novel, some miners go through Iceland, and suddenly it's everywhere. And COVID, we watch the same thing. It's suddenly everywhere. So spillover events have always happened throughout history. Probably, people were always out there in the forest hunting for something. They probably all, got something, picked up some virus, but it died, it might have ripped through the local population, but then it kind of died out. It had nowhere to go. Now we pick it up and move it, in a couple hours, we move it several thousand miles. That is, from a virus's perspective, nirvana. There's no end to the possibilities. And so that's really what we're seeing. And in both cases, our globalization, which, epidemiologists have been warning about for decades now, is a recipe. It's just, that's how you get pandemics. You can't get a pandemic without moving a disease through the whole world. And we have, been able to do that for quite a while now, and have had many pandemics, and we just maybe thought we'd outwitted them, but au contraire.
I want to talk about another issue on animals, but first sort of footnote. So what is it with this number 6? I mean, I know you and Jim are good friends, but Phase 6, Sixth Extinction, what?
Yeah.
Why 6?
I don't know. You gotta ask Jim. We both came up with six. I think maybe does phase 6 refer to sort of the level of, I can't remember, but if the sixth extinction, I can only tell you, refers to the fact that, we've had 5 major mass extinctions and are in or on the verge of a sixth. And that is not my term at all. I did not, come up with the term the sixth extinction. That was completely in use. I picked it up.
All right, let me go back to, because you talked about the issue of how we treat animals, and you were thinking of wild animals. But let's talk about domestic animals also in all of this. And it's related to the issue of agriculture again. And that is the use of antibiotics in cattle and hog and chicken raising. And because, I mean, the viruses are one thing, bacteria are another thing. And certainly the growing ineffectiveness of antibiotics is in large function or a result of the way in which we feed animals and the like, and the effect of that animal feed, which is filled with antibiotics, on the biome, because I think the whole issue of the biome is another really important issue that does not get adequate attention.
Well, I mean, I want to say that, the way we treat animals, just to go back for a moment to, the bringing in an animal from, what we'll call the wild, but what is also crucial there, and probably crucial in many of these, spillover events, which in some cases lead to an epidemic or now a pandemic, is probably in many cases their encounter with domesticated animals and the way we crowd animals together, and swine flu and avian flu. Those are all absolutely a function, as you say, of the way that we, of our domesticated animals, and they may come into contact with an animal, an undomesticated animal, and that. But as soon as that happens, as soon as you get that event, and then you have just, fantastic numbers of practically identical animals, and that disease will spread very, very fast. And so you're constantly reading about, having to slaughter, thousands and thousands of animals who suddenly had some pathogen, sweep through in a desperate effort to prevent, a sort of, porcine pandemic or an avian pandemic. But that's the way a lot of our diseases, that's the way they roll. They get into a domesticated population. Antibiotic resistance is, as you say, another huge issue. It's not a virus, it's a bacterial problem, but we have, it's a little bit parallel to what we're talking about with nitrogen. We've just doused the world with antibiotics. What could go wrong? Well, what could go wrong is that, you lose the ability, the few antibiotics that we have to treat really resistant infections. And, there are very scary reports. I try to avoid, constantly writing about only the scariest, most horrible things. But if you do want to scare yourself silly, read these reports about, how we're running out of antibiotics and how the next bacterial pathogen that gets us, could be a bacterial one, because we have no more arrows in that quiver. We just have used up our antibiotics and wasted them and been really profligate with them.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about politics. Both domestic, we're pretty clear on, but it seems to me the crucial issue in dealing with many of the problems you're talking about, the United States and China. And we're not on a path toward any kind of increased cooperation there. How is it possible to begin to address these issues? There's so many internal problems in this country, but without any kind of engagement between China and the United States.
Well, I'm I think it's clear, that I'm no Pollyanna here, but I do think there has been, I do think there has been engagement with the Chinese, and I do think there is constant engagement, and I think that the Biden administration is very keenly aware you're not solving these issues with solving. I mean, I use that term advisedly. You're not getting anywhere, say, on climate change. And before the latest round of talks in Glasgow, which everyone felt were very disappointing, and I certainly share that view, but there was some pretty intense talks with the Chinese to prevent those from falling apart before they had even started. How's that? So I think it's certainly understood that that's needed, but the big problem with climate change is that it's a global problem, and it requires global action to solve. And that has always, the US and China, pointing fingers at each other, has always been a big barrier to action. And both countries have to feel, I have sort of become convinced that it is in their national interest to deal with this before anything's going to get done. And for a whole slew of reasons, they apparently don't feel that yet. And so we are in the basic holding pattern that we're in now, and that is untenable. So that will not last, because it simply cannot last. It's simply geophysically, we're destabilizing the world. So I have confidence that it can't last that much longer, but it can last long enough to lead to disastrous consequences.
And that's we're back now to this issue of time and timing, because isn't really, all of these systems that you're talking about and their interrelationships are positive feedback systems, which are accelerating. And is it too late?
Well, I think that it's too late for some things, but it's not too late for other things. And one of the great, and I will turn this back to you as the professor of religion. I mean, one of the great ethical conundrums is sort of action under uncertainty, under conditions of uncertainty, and that is that is what we're faced with. There are certain thresholds which we have probably crossed, probably can't take back, though not impossible. I mean, that's why we start looking at things like solar geoengineering. But we don't know. We don't know exactly where they are. We don't know if we're ahead of them. We don't know if we're behind them. That is why there's been a lot of talk about trying to keep average global temperatures from rising more than 1.5 degrees C, the sense that that is a limit beyond which you really don't want to go, beyond which you're sort of pushing outside of the envelope in which human beings evolved. But are we too late for that? Yes, I will say that pretty definitively. We're not going to hold global temperature increases to 1.5 degrees C for all intents and purposes. We're already there. Can we keep it below 2? I think that will be very, very, very challenging. And does that, but that never means that you sort of get to say, well, we didn't hold it to 2, therefore I give up, because then there's 3, then there's always more damage to be done. So we are really now in a damage control situation. And in climate change, there's a saying, avoid the unmanageable and manage the unavoidable. That is the situation we're in. And we're not doing a very good job at avoiding the unmanageable right now. I have to say, we're sort of plowing ahead.
You mentioned under the white sky a few minutes ago, where you do talk about some of the possible technological steps. My reading of that book was your heart's not really in that.
That's so true. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I'm sort of the kind of person who likes to go visit Glen Canyon. So I don't relish the idea of a world of, genetically manipulated creatures, living under a manipulated, sky. But I do I wrote that book because I see that as the pattern. I kept running into this. Well, this is foreclosed. This is foreclosed. We're not going to stop burning carbon. We're not going to, all these things that we're not going to do, that you just look around and say, okay, well, that's true from a practical matter. We're not doing that. So what is left but, this sort of Hail Mary pass of a techno fix. And I think that we keep reaching for that. And so the book is is absolutely a cautionary tale, in ways that could go wrong.
Right. But ethically and philosophically, I'd say, I mean, it has always seemed to me that part of the dilemma is that there needs to be some kind of fundamental change about the vision of the world, the way we interpret and understand the world, which is in effect a certain kind of conversion. But those things are unrealistic often, and they take time, and time is precisely, it seems, what we don't have with so many of these issues. As I said at the outset, we do not, if one does not listen to what you're saying, does it at his or her own peril. And I really appreciate for all your thoughts, your honesty, and the depth of your responses to all this. So let's see if we have a few questions, if I can figure out how to do all this. Whoops, all right. Here I have a couple questions here. So this is from Helena Colinda. So thank you for the conversation and the important writing and thinking you do. I'm in awe. I planned to write to you for years with a question, but I wasn't sure how to connect. What happens to nuclear power plants if the civilization unravels in systems for cooling the uranium rods and etc. no longer work? Will we have multiple nuclear meltdowns? And what will the implications be for the planet?
Wow, that's a good question. I mean, the fuel that's in, the spent fuel pools, once we stopped, I guess, if we just walked away from our nuclear power plants, bad stuff would happen. But if we, shut them down and took out the spent fuel, and this was a huge thing at Fukushima. There were these spent fuel pools, which are they're very, very hot. They still require constant cooling, and there was real fears that those pools, in addition to the active meltdown, that water was not getting into those pools, and that they were going to have another huge release of radiation. And one of the amazing things about that was that there was like another leak, just an accidental leak into the spent fuel pools, and that prevented that from happening. But it was a very, very, very dicey situation. So, if we just walked away from our spent fuel pools, for example, it would not be, like a nuclear core meltdown, I don't believe, although I honestly don't want to pretend to be an expert on this, but it would be a very bad situation. And it's why people are very concerned about these spent fuel pools that exist now all around the US, because we have never developed a permanent repository for our nuclear waste. So we just leave it on site. So it's a really interesting question. If we just stopped doing anything, I think it's probably a pretty scary prognosis, but I also, as I say, don't want to claim to be an expert on that.
So somewhat related, there was a report yesterday or the day before out of, I think it was Cambridge University, that there'd been a successful implementation of fusion. I don't know if you read that or not. Does it? I mean, that's been a dream for a long time. I mean, is it? I mean, the scientists they interviewed were optimistic, yada, yada, yada. What's your take on that?
You know, there's this sort of like fusion is always, you know, fusion is the energy of the future and always will be, to paraphrase I think it was Charles de Gaulle. Anyway, I don't know, you know, the question of whether we're going to get you know, controlled fusions reactions from which you get out more energy than you give, is, you know, that's sort of the holy grail. Has been for a long time. You know, we are extremely technologically adept, and I think, you know, it's possible. That would, you know, be a huge breakthrough, if you could really get, you know, carbon-free energy of a sort of infinite variety. But I don't think it would solve all of our problems. You know, it would be then the question of what we did with all that energy if we continued to, you know, use it to produce nitrogen fertilizer,
Right.
you know. So
right.
so the notion that we can just go on endlessly using energy and sort of using up the planet, as it were. There's a great quote from it was very popular, I think, in back in the 70s by this economist Kenneth Boulding. It's one of my favorite quotes. The only people who think you can have infinite growth on a finite planet are madmen and economists. And you know, that's the situation that we're in. So fusion, I think, would be, obviously it would be huge. It would be a huge tool for climate change, but it wouldn't, it would still put us, it would still leave it to ourselves to set some sort of limits on our behavior.
Right. Okay, we have another question here from June. Based on your observations of climate change, do you think that capitalism can fix climate change?
You know, that is such a good question. I'd love to see a kind of debate here. I'm often asked that, and I guess the only thing I can say is, you know, looking at the world right now and not seeing many signs that we're abandoning capitalism, I have to say I hope so. But, you know, is it possible? It does get back a little bit to that Kenneth Boulding quote, you know, about madmen and economists. If you have an economy that is dependent on endless growth, you know, how can a finite planet sustain that? So I don't know whether we can deal with climate change either in a kind of, you know, small bore way of simply dealing with our carbon problem, just converting our whole energy system to carbon-free energy. That should be possible in a capitalist system, but I can't say that it's happening. But whether you could come to some accommodation in a broader sense with the limits of life on planet Earth in a system that constantly demands more consumption is unclear.
Of course, one of the things I thought about quite a bit is, you know, where and when did the ideology of growth kick in? It hasn't been there all along.
No,
and
absolutely not.
You know, there are some who argue that it at least got. I mean, we understand how capitalism works under industrialization, so on and so forth. But that a crucial factor in this whole emphasis on growth was the Cold War, and the competition between capitalism, communism, and this a centralized and a decentralized kind of market model. But that you know that whole. I mean, you read about companies that are doing very, very well, and then they'll acquire another company and go bust. You know, I mean you know, this insistence that to be viable, you have to continue to grow. And as you say, the Earth's round. But I don't think I don't think that's a permanent. I mean, that, you know, I'm not an economist and I can't work that out. But I think this ideology of economic growth is a relatively recent invention.
Well, I certainly think you're right, although I'm not sure that it's as recent as the Cold War. But, you know, I think that the other thing that is driving it, and that, you know, we do have to kind of acknowledge is population growth. It's very hard to have a shrinking economy or a shrinking consumption when your population is still growing, and the world's population is still growing and will be growing for many decades, you know, barring catastrophe. So that's another issue that needs to be, you know, factored in, you know, and the huge inequality on planet Earth. You know, some of us are consuming a tremendous amount, way beyond our equitable share, and some people are not. So it's one thing also to talk about, you know, an end to growth sitting in Williamstown or New York, and it's another thing to talk about it if you haven't had your share of the growth yet. So I think these are immensely complicated. I cannot exaggerate that either, how difficult these issues are.
Yeah, I mean, when population growth is a function of both ends, I mean, increased birth and increased lifespan, which is also which is also an ideology of Silicon Valley in certain ways to extend that kind of. But it's also the case, and I think you're absolutely right here, that the only way these problems can be adequately addressed is with a radical redistribution of wealth and resources and the like, and that does not seem to be in the cards. And another aspect of the factors that you've been talking about this evening is the disruption in terms of human populations, in terms of migrations and the like, which is going to be, I mean, it's already happened, and the political fallout of that, at least part of the problem with Mexico is crop failures in Central America and the like. And you know, and Friedman's been arguing for a long time that the Arab Spring was caused by drought, because it led to crop failure, increased bread prices and the like. And even more recently was suggesting the political impact of permafrost melting on the political situation with Russia and Ukraine. I mean, the ways in which these ecological issues are going to be politically and economically totally disrupted. And that change is going to be radical.
Absolutely. And I mean, you know, one group, and it's kind of underappreciated, but one group that definitely, you know, I think sees the threat of climate change, even as, you know, as administrations change and play out the threat, or not play out the threat, or acknowledge a threat or play it down, is the US military. You know, it's a very, climate change is a hugely destabilizing force. There's just no getting around that.
Betsy, this has been wonderful. And I want to say again, you know, I set the bar high, but we are all in your debt for the work that you're doing and the writing that you're doing. It has an enormous influence. It's educational and I think politically influential, and we all appreciate it.
Well, that really means a lot to me coming from you, Mark, so thank you.
I mean it, Betsy.
Thank you.
Your work is invaluable.
Thank you.
So thank you, and thank you. Though we can't see you out there, we appreciate your being with us tonight.